It's my great pleasure to welcome here to our campus and Professor Tom Schwandt from the University of Illinois. He's a lion, I guess, in the world of evaluation, and we're pleased to have him. I mean, you look at all the honors and publications he's done to contribute great intellectual insight. It's wonderful to have him here as the person who inaugurates our education department colloquium series. So we're really pleased at that. And one of the reasons that we wanted to have a department-wide colloquium series is to help us as a community understand the breadth of what we do and understand how the breadth of what we do contributes to understanding at the connections. So I was taken when I did a little bit of reading online and about Tom, that one of the things that his bio says that his work is at the intersection of social research and practical philosophy. And I said, that's a great person to have here for our first talk, because these two things can be thought of as being spanning a wide spectrum, and to have someone who will come and talk to us about how things that span a very wide spectrum contribute to conjoined problems is really exciting. So I want you all to join me in welcoming here to GSNEIS Professor Thomas Schwandt.
Are we good with the sound? Thanks, Louis. It's an honor, and it's sort of humbling to be an inaugural speaker because the expectations are so high, you know. But hopefully, I'll deliver on what you referred to as the kind of work that I do at the intersection of social science methodology and practical philosophy. Let me begin by saying it comes as no surprise to many of you in this room that evaluation is ubiquitous in everyday life. It's evident in the annual performance appraisals that people are subject to, the assessment of a good golf swing, which is closely important to me, in the scholarly review of books, in quality control procedures in manufacturing, in the ratings of products by agencies such as Consumers Union. Forensic psychologists are a common aspect, and their evaluations are a common aspect of many court proceedings. Teachers evaluate the performance of their students. Judges assess and score athlete performances in high school diving competitions. Drama critics in local newspapers appraise the quality of local theater productions. Foundation officers examine the investments they make in social programs and ask whether they yield value for money. Evaluation and its kindred notions of appraising, assessing, auditing, ranking, rating, grading are social phenomena that all of us encounter at one time or another in our lives. However, again, as I know many of you in this room are aware, we can also identify what might be called a professional approach to evaluation that is linked to both an identity and a way of practicing that sets it apart from these everyday evaluation undertakings. That professional approach is characterized by specialized expert knowledge and skills that are possessed by individuals who claim the designation evaluator. Expert knowledge, in turn, is the product of a particular type of disciplined inquiry, an organized, scholarly, and professional mode of knowledge production. I use the term professional practice intentionally to signify that evaluation is not simply a technical undertaking. Undoubtedly, effective practice requires a wide range of skills for the competent execution of all manner of tasks involved in evaluation, including negotiating contracts, preparing evaluation budgets, designing evaluations, managing them, choosing and designing instruments, analyzing and reporting data, and so on. However, in addition to these ways of knowing how, evaluation practice requires knowing why. I use the term disciplined inquiry in the same manner that Lee Cronbach and Patrick Suppies used it more than 40 years ago. It refers to systematic, empirical processes of discovery and verification, wherein the argument is clear and the logical processes that link evidence to credible conclusions are apparent. Evaluation is a form of disciplined inquiry concerned with the determination of value. And that particular trait distinguishes it from forms of disciplined inquiry that employ social science research methods in the service of diagnosing, explaining, and solving social problems. Of course, evaluation is concerned with the merits of various approaches to social problem solving, and thus it shares with those types of inquiry a broad ambition to contribute to the social good. The prime institutional locations of the conduct of a form of disciplined inquiry that yields evaluation knowledge are universities, policy analysis and evaluation units of government agencies and international organizations, and private research institutes and firms, such as Brookings, for example, or WestEd. The primary producers are academics, think tank experts, and other types of professionals who are engaged in the knowledge occupation known as evaluation, or perhaps for some, more broadly, research and evaluation. Evaluation is thus a professional undertaking that individuals with a specific kind of educational preparation claim to know a great deal about, on the one hand, and practice in systematic and disciplined ways on the other hand. This knowledge base and the methodical and well-organized way of conducting evaluation sets the expert practice apart from what occurs in the normal course of evaluating activities in everyday life. It is this idea of professional evaluation and preparation for that undertaking that is my topic today. The individuals who comprise the community of professional practitioners in evaluation are a very diverse lot. As Laurie Stavan and Jean King noted a few years ago, there are three broad types of evaluation professionals. Experienced evaluators who have been practicing for some time, either as privately employed or as employees of a research organization or as an academic. Novices that enter the field for the first time seeking to develop knowledge and skills. And what they call accidental evaluators, that is, people without training who have been given responsibility for conducting evaluations as part of their portfolio of responsibilities, and who are trying to sort out exactly what will be necessary to do the job. Perhaps the most significant sources of preparation for many who are either novices or accidental evaluators, or those who are just learning about the practice while they're employed in some other kind of professional capacity, are short courses, training institutes, workshops, webinars that are often sponsored by professional evaluation associations. Also, certificate programs offered by universities in online or traditional classroom settings. At my own university, we're considering developing an evaluation certificate that you can earn by taking simply 3 courses. And of course, toolkits. Toolkits prepared by agencies and available on the internet. As I was preparing this talk, I entered the phrase evaluation toolkits on a Google search and found 22 million hits. Hits that included toolkits prepared by the Foundation Center, the World Bank, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, FSG, a consulting firm up the way in Northern California, the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Malaria, and Tuberculosis, the Coalition for Community Schools, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality Resource Center, to name but a few sources. The rapid development and expansion of these toolkits and these other types of training resources are in part a response to the demand from practitioners in various social service, educational, and public health occupations to learn the basics of evaluation models and techniques, because doing an evaluation has become one of their job responsibilities, perhaps permanently, but typically often only temporarily. Indirect evidence of the growing significance of these kinds of training resources for preparing evaluators comes from trends in the composition of the membership of the American Evaluation Association, the largest evaluation membership organization in the world, approaching 8,000 members. Studies of the membership in recent years have revealed that practitioner and accidental pathways into the profession of evaluation are 4 times more prevalent than academic pathways. Moreover, the association recently told me that only about 30% of its membership identifies as college or university affiliated. This trend to train up evaluators is also consistent with broader cultural efforts to scientize and rationalize the professional practices of education, healthcare, and social services by focusing directly on measurable performance, outcomes, and the development of an evidence base of best practices. In this climate, evaluators function as technicians who, when they are equipped with tools for doing results-based management, program monitoring, performance assessment, and impact evaluation, provide reliable evidence of outcomes and contribute to the establishment of this evidence base. While providing evidence for accountability and decision-making is certainly an important undertaking, the danger in this way of viewing the practice of evaluation is that assurance is substituted for valuation. Evaluation comes to be seen, for the most part, as one of the technologies needed for assuring effective and efficient management and delivery of programs, as well as for documenting achievement of targets and expected outcomes. The idea that evaluation is a form of critical appraisal concerned with judging value begins to fade from concern. At worst, this trend to narrowly train contributes to the erosion of the ideal of evaluation as a form of social trusteeship, whereby a professional's work contributes to the public good, and its replacement of this ideal with the notion of technical professionalism, where the professional is little more than a supplier of expert services to willing buyers. In this scenario, evaluation is both conceived of and governed as a market good, not a public good. Focusing almost exclusively on efforts to train individuals to do evaluation can readily lead to a divorce of technique from calling that brought forth the professional field in the first place. Furthermore, while learning about evaluation approaches along with acquiring technical skills in designing and conducting evaluations are surely essential to being a competent practitioner, by focusing primarily only on training in models and methods, whether this is intended or not, creates the impression that evaluation primarily requires only knowing how. Taking some license with an idea borrowed from the organizational theorist Chris Argyris, we might characterize evaluation training in knowing how as a type of single-loop learning. It is learning problem solving, how to apply procedures and rules to be sure we are, in a phrase, doing things right. In single-loop learning, we take for granted the goals, the values, norms, and frameworks that underlie why we do what we do. Argyris contrasted the reactive mindset of single-loop learning with the productive mindset of double-loop learning. The latter asks, are we doing the right things? And involves examining and reassessing goals, values, and frameworks by asking why and so what that help improve understanding. Triple-loop learning goes even further by challenging existing learning frameworks as well as mental models and assumptions. The core question here is, what makes this the right thing to do? This kind of learning involves examining one's professional identity and the aims of one's profession, as well as how one's frame of reference, style of thinking, and how one's behavior produce both intended and unintended consequences. The cultivation of double-loop and triple-loop learning in evaluators is my primary interest in my career. This aim reflects my long-standing concern that training and technique in evaluation must be wedded to education in both the disposition and the capacity to engage in moral, ethical, and political reflection on the aim of one's professional undertaking. A few years ago, I encountered a wonderful phrase from a colleague that captured this idea that I'm interested in. In 2002, the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching convened a seminar as part of its continuing examination of education for the professions. They were looking at engineering, nursing, law, ministry, and so on. In that seminar that was led by one of my colleagues, Bill Sullivan, participants were invited to discuss the various pedagogical approaches they used in their professional schools that would help students develop, and the phrase they used, develop a life of the mind for practice. Participants defined this notion as critical thinking through lived situations that demand action with and behalf of others. Developing a life of the mind for practice certainly involves all three of those types of learning that I just sketched. However, the phrase particularly draws our attention to the fact that professional practice requires both a capacity for discretionary judgment, that is, critical thinking, that issues and appropriate actions, as well as a clear realization of the social purpose of the practice, that is, action with and behalf of others. To possess a life of the mind for evaluation practice is to recognize that the professional practice is a matter of designing means for investigating and rendering judgments of value that will be effective in light of a wide variety of contextual circumstances, political and ethical considerations, client expectations, and resource constraints. It is to realize that assumptions that evaluation practitioners and the public make about the purpose and roles of evaluation, how and why it is of service to society, the uses to which evaluation knowledge is put, and the evidence employed in arguments about value are almost always contested or contestable and are constantly being revisited in professional practice. A life of the mind for practice is required because central to the nature of professional work is the notion that it lacks uniformity in the problems it must contend with and the solutions it must invent. Donald Schwandt argued years ago that the problems of real-world professional practice are really not problems at all, but messy, undefined situations that he called indeterminate zones of practice, i.e. uncertainty, uniqueness, and value conflict that escape the canons of technical rationality. By that he meant that approaches to technical problem solving, the clear-cut application of theory or technique from the storehouse of professional knowledge, and the unambiguous means-end reasoning that we are so interested in, simply fail to be useful in addressing such problems. To face these kinds of situations and to act appropriately, the professional must learn practical reason or the capacity for discretionary judgment. The necessity of having the capacity of practical reason as a professional evaluator is driven home when you reflect on the considerable heterogeneity of evaluation practice. Arguably, although the field of evaluation may generally accept the premise that what evaluators do is evaluate, answers to the questions about what exactly that means, how it should be done, how the purpose of evaluation is to be understood in different organizational contexts, what the evaluator's role is and should be in the process, all display considerable variability. For this reason alone, a vital aspect in the development of a life of the mind for practice is thoughtful, perceptive, and continual engagement with what, for lack of a better term, could be called the landscape of evaluation issues. This landscape encompasses assumptions, principles, values, and ways of reasoning that inform how evaluators define and position their professional activity and argue for the usefulness of their work to society. It includes notions about what comprises evaluative evidence and how that evidence is to be used in making claims about merit, worth, or significance of policies and programs. It incorporates perspectives on the ethical conduct, political stance, and professional obligations of evaluation professionals. Moreover, this landscape is multi- and interdisciplinary, with concepts, theories, and empirical findings from social psychology, political science, organizational theory, philosophy, and other fields all informing perspectives on key issues. Others have characterized this landscape as the core set of questions, disputes, and issues that the professional practice of evaluation as a particular kind of discipline inquiry must always contend with. Almost 25 years ago, Tom Cook, Will Shadish, and Laura Leviton offered the first comprehensive effort to map what they referred to as the foundations of program evaluation. They held that their book, and I'm quoting, was meant to encourage the theoretical dispositions of practitioners by expanding their repertoire of methods, challenging the assumptions behind their methodological and strategic decisions, and creating a broader conceptual framework for them to use in their work. They expected that upon engaging in the analysis of the work of several theorists that they presented in this book, their readers would be able to better address key questions about how social programs contribute to social problem solving, what constitutes credible evidence, how judgments of value are to be made, and so on. They concluded their book by noting that there were several unresolved issues in evaluation that included some of these. Should evaluators work as change agents? By whose criteria of merit should we judge social programs? Should evaluation results be synthesized into a single value judgment? What methods should evaluators use? What should the role of the evaluator be? What values should be represented in the evaluation? Some 20 years later, in their edited volume, Fundamental Issues in Evaluation, our colleagues Nick Smith and Paul Brandon wrote that these issues, quote, by their very nature are never finally solved, only temporarily resolved, and they influence the character of evaluation theory, method, practice, and indeed the very profession itself. And they identified another list. Why should we undertake evaluation? What's the proper role for the evaluator? How should stakeholders be involved in evaluation? What constitutes acceptable evidence for evaluation decisions? How should we arrive at the most valid understanding of program quality? The very fact that these issues endure is reason enough to argue that the pursuit of professional practice and evaluation requires developing a life of the mind for practice. As a thesis, cultivating a life of the mind for practice involves the recognition that although knowledge and skills involved in the choice and application of methods and techniques are necessary to do good work, professional practice is best characterized by the capacity for discretionary judgment and a sense of identity that is linked to a realization of the social purpose of the practice. Judgment is a situated, practice-based form of reasoning that differs from both means-end reasoning and rational calculation. Although sites where practice is conducted may yield concrete, practical, and working knowledge, those who possess a life of the mind for practice realize that engagement with a body of theoretical knowledge, concepts, principles, and insights best guides their judgment, their discretionary judgment. The notion of a life of the mind for practice unites two ideas, thought and action. To focus only on the former, the life of the mind, is to be concerned exactly, but narrowly, with cultivating the capacity for rational thought and intellectualism, a notion often negatively associated, particularly in the minds of some of my students that I teach, with the idea of there's too much thinking going on here. To focus only on the latter, for practice, is to be concerned primarily with knowledge and skills required for the customary and habitual performance of well-defined tasks. But a life of the mind for practice intentionally brings together theoretical understandings and practical reasoning, putting both to work in developing good judgment. My concern is, what happens to the notion of preparing a life of the mind for practice as evaluation becomes increasingly viewed as little more than an extensive collection of practical guides, toolkits, and techniques for data collection, presentation, and reporting. Even more worrisome to me, what happens to that notion as evaluation becomes defined primarily by its role and its function in bureaucratic and managerial systems, as a tool for quality assurance, performance management, and for assessing conformance to standards or benchmarks. Evaluation practice so conceived is the province of the technician, who principally relies on following procedures and correctly applying methods. Of course, if the field of evaluation is content with developing highly skilled technicians, then I have nothing else to say. If those technicians are people who they're content to have them operate effectively in systems that employ technologies of measurement and evaluation, then my concern about developing professionals who exhibit the characteristics of a life of the mind for practice is moot. Yet, there are many signs, both domestically and internationally, that point towards strong interest in the field of evaluation in its continued professionalization. Thus, I invite you to at least entertain my hypothesis while acknowledging it requires more thorough empirical investigation. If we accept tentatively the idea that evaluation practice is becoming more technical than professional, and if we are concerned with ways in which such a trend might be reversed, then one important consideration is how do we prepare individuals for the practice? More specifically, where is it that one develops a life of the mind for practice? As I noted earlier, in recent years it appears that for a variety of reasons, not least of which is response to market demand, routes to learning about the practice are less characterized by full-time university graduate education programs and more by means such as certificates, workshops, institutes, and so on. And a really disturbing trend that I personally think is disturbing is the ability to attract professionals to coffee break webinars where we learn everything over a cup of coffee and 15 minutes of eating our sandwiches. A common pedagogical perspective on the training of evaluation practitioners reflected in these particular routes, maybe not the webinars, is that the practitioner must have a solid understanding of a core body of knowledge and ways of reasoning that define the practice, coupled with some kind of skill-based apprenticeship where he or she acquires the craft know-how that's characteristic of the practice. And thus we see the typical focus on models and approaches of the major evaluation theorists, along with training in social science methods and their application in evaluation, and all of that coupled with an awareness of codes of professional conduct. All of this is, of course, considerably compressed if one is enrolled in workshops, short courses, and institutes. And in addition to acquiring familiarity with this knowledge and skill base, this perspective emphasizes training to develop three kinds of capacities: the capacity to make technical judgments, the capacity to make procedural judgments, and the capacity to be reflective. Technical judgments are about how to apply one's existing knowledge and skills to a routine task, like how do I design instruments to measure satisfaction with program services, as well as the kinds of knowledge and skills that beneficiaries acquired in the program. Procedural judgments involve comparing skills and tools available to determine what works best for the situation at hand. Example would be, how do I visually represent the results of this evaluation to this client? The capacity to be reflective means that practitioners are thinking carefully about the tasks that they face and asking whether their existing knowledge is adequate to address those tasks, and whether they should seek additional ways to enhance their knowledge and skills, and so on. And training in these three capacities is all acquired within the context of standards for professional products, standards for evaluating evaluations, as well as professional conduct ethical guidelines. However, professionalism in evaluation and the professionalization of the practice of evaluation means something more than what is captured in that training model and in the associated lists of competencies or capabilities that deal with systematic inquiry, technical practice, project management, and attention to a variety of dispositions and attitudes that characterize evaluation behavior. We do not need to enter into a long and complicated and not particularly easy debate about what constitutes a profession and whether evaluation at present qualifies as such in order to grasp a point about the connection between preparation for a field of practice and the norms that define a profession. But we do need to understand that it is a profession's social ends and civic foundations more so than its technical demands that define it. Hence this quote from Bill Sullivan and his colleague. The commitment to serve the public interest sets the terms of the essential compact between the profession and the society, providing the basis for the profession's autonomy and public esteem. Although other occupational fields may require high levels of knowledge and skill, they cannot be considered professions unless they are centrally defined as serving some important aspect of the common good. Thus, the relationship between the professions and the general society is inherently ethical at its core. Understanding professionalism means making sense of all those competencies that are explored by all kinds of evaluators in the United States and Australasia and Canada and so on and so forth, but only in the context of the profession's fundamental purposes that are embodied in its conception of its social roles and responsibilities. Understanding professionalism means wrestling with how that social purpose relates to notions of community, responsibility, and identity. Community is a matter of understanding the context in which professional practice unfolds and in which the evaluator performs a particular kind of role. What place does the profession and the professional occupy in that wider community? Responsibility is a matter of grasping that as a professional, what one does on the behalf of others, and thus it involves making sense of what it means to serve a client, stakeholders, and the public. Identity is a matter of answering the question, what does it mean to be a particular kind of person whose action is founded on certain kinds of knowledge and skill, oriented by a particular set of responsibilities? Answers to these three questions point to the public purposes and ethical norms that constitute the very idea of a profession. Evaluators ought to function and be seen in society as more than technical experts. They ought to convey to their clients and the public at large the idea of evaluation as a practical, intellectual disposition and outlook on social and political life. Through their engagement with those who commission and fund evaluations, those who direct and manage programs, those who craft social policies, and those who are the intended beneficiaries of efforts to solve social problems, evaluators ought to teach that evaluation is about experimenting, social criticism, constant questioning, objective appraisal, candor, intellectual honesty, and modesty in our claims to know what is of value. Evaluators ought to embody in their work the viewpoint that reasoned evaluative criticism should play a central role in the achievement, maintenance, and enhancement of the good society. In conducting their work, evaluators should embrace the complexity of social problems and the concomitant limitations on our ability to predict, plan, and control interventions designed to address them. If you don't understand why this is important, read the recent blog post on the Institute for Educational Sciences blog that came out yesterday. Because they, above all other professionals, are skilled in judging the value of attempts at social problem solving in complex circumstances. Evaluators ought to advocate for an experimenting society committed to innovation, social reality testing, learning, self-criticism, and the avoidance of self-deception. Yet evaluators must ever be mindful that an experimenting society is not one in which policymakers, program directors, and and their performance monitoring allies seek to manage social and economic affairs in an apolitical, managerialist, and scientized manner. Social problem solving, policy making, and evaluation are not exercises in social technology. And an experimenting society is an evaluating society, not an audit society. So what would education for evaluators who thought like this look like with this kind of, if it had this kind of ethical core? I suggest that in light of the heterogeneity of evaluation practice that I sketched earlier, the field of evaluation might be best served if it devoted greater attention to encouraging educational opportunities that combined instruction in the rational capacity for critically appraising knowledge of evaluation methods and principles with an exploration of moral commitment. Moral commitment signifies attention to the social purpose of the practice, in other words, its ethical core. Individuals seeking to become evaluators, and perhaps already are practicing, might be encouraged to ask, what are the intellectual and practical, meaning moral, political, commitments that I am capable of and competent to perform when it comes to conducting studies of the value of social programs and discussing the meaning of evaluation with a variety of different stakeholders? From that broad question, a host of others follow. Where do I stand on the matter of how evaluation serves democratic aims and social justice? Whose interest in evaluation should I serve? Is it possible for me to take an independent, objective stance as an evaluator, one that resists capture by managerial or other vested interests? How do I interpret the concern with causality in social programs? How do I justify my choice of criteria and a values basis for judgments of the merit of programs and policies? It is in light of these kinds of questions that the study of evaluation models and methods and attention to evaluation abilities, skills, and aptitudes, that is, the know-how of evaluation, acquire particular salience and relevance. Acquiring training in models, techniques, and methods of evaluations without examination of these kinds of questions is a little bit like deciding what to wear before you've even been invited to the party. The central issue is how aspiring evaluators will learn both to ask and to develop answers to these questions, while at the same time they are acquiring necessary technical knowledge and skills. In short, where can they best learn about a life of the mind for professional evaluation practice? It's Columbia University Library. I believe this can be done best, and perhaps only, in a university where a liberal education is joined to specialized training. Of course, we can be way too glib about such an assertion like that. A university education for professions that effectively marries education in practical reason with specialized skills and knowledge faces serious challenges that stem from vulnerabilities that are inherent in the very idea of professionalism, as well as from the character of university education in present time. Let's take the first issue. Even in the most established professions at the present time, there's considerable anxiety about the erosion of the professional ideal. Market-driven philosophies have turned many doctors into medical service providers. For an increasing number of lawyers, justice has become privatized and restricted to the interests of their paying clients. The very mention of Enron and Arthur Andersen signifies a breakdown in the logic of professionalism in the accounting world. Organizational consultants are viewed as vendors, and their relationships to clients are cost-driven, commodity-based transactional exchanges. Demands for greater productivity in all professions, from nursing to education to engineering, are draining the intrinsic meaning from professional work. Add to this the kind of burnout, cynicism, and acceptance of mediocre practice that accompanies the loss of faith in the capacity of a profession to achieve its central purpose, and we have a bad situation brewing. And if these are profound concerns in the established professions, then one is led to wonder, what do we make of them and the meaning and status of the professional ideal in the emerging professionalization of the field of evaluation? Turning to education itself. It itself is beset by several kinds of current problems. Academic departments, probably present one excluded, all right, tend to be silos. And thus they work against the kind of interdisciplinary awareness of concepts, theories, and methods that evaluation practice demands. For example, students studying evaluation in political science learn how political scientists think about evaluation and policy analysis, but they don't understand how psychologists think about it, right? Let alone how those in professional schools, such as business, law, education, and so on and so forth, might conceive of the concept in practice. I only lost one person so far, not bad. If one studies evaluation in a professional school, that one tends to run the risk that the curriculum lacks breadth and depth, leaving one ill-prepared methodologically and equally unaware of the enterprise of evaluation outside that professional school. Finally, and it's certainly true of my university, okay, two people. It's no secret that universities, particularly state universities, three, given their financial pressures and the demands to demonstrate value for money, are increasingly succumbing to vocationalism. Yet, despite all those worries, we still look to our best universities as places that offer a type of education that prepares one to exercise professional judgment. They are places that can and should provide preparation in theoretical knowledge and practical reason, and that should cultivate the central idea that the life of the mind is essential to effective professional practice. They are sites where we expect to find students and practicing professionals engaged intellectually and motivationally in the core issues of the practice and the leading edge of a profession's work. Of course, we must ask whether the current curriculum for evaluation education in university-based programs adequately prepares students in this way for a life of the mind for practice. Here, data are fairly sparse. We know that university-based education graduate programs have little difficulty in offering introductory and advanced courses in evaluation that cover models as well as practical issues and concerns in planning and conducting an evaluation, along with courses in research methods. And many also offer field experience through, as you have here, through internships, practicum, graduate assistantships, and so on. I would argue all of this is absolutely necessary, but not sufficient. Research conducted as part of the preparation for the professions program undertaken by the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching revealed that the following qualities make for sustainable, lifelong growth in professional competence and commitment. Deep engagement with the profession's public purposes, along with a sense of meaning and satisfaction from one's work that is grounded in or aligned with those purposes. Strong professional identity, that is an identity as a professional in which the field's missions and standards such as integrity and conscientiousness, are essential features of one's conception of the field and of oneself as a member of that field. Habits of interpretation or salience through which complex situations are understood or framed, at least in part, in moral terms. That is, in terms of the field's purposes and standards. Habitual patterns of behavioral response to those one works with, clients, subordinates, authorities, peers, all aligned with the profession's standards and ideals. And the capacity and inclination to contribute to the ethical quality of the profession and its institutions. This includes a sense of moral agency in relation to morally questionable aspects of the institutional context and the moral imagination and courage to create more constructive institutional structures or practices. Whether existing university programs that prepare evaluators foster these qualities essential to a life of the mind for practice is an unanswered question. However, the future of evaluation, as a professional practice committed to promoting the public good through judging the value of human activity depends in large part on their ability to do so. Thank you.
We have questions. And maybe I'll take the prerogative to ask the first one. Well, first of all, thank you for a great talk. I really enjoyed it. And one way to see your talk is that it's broadly about how, this is the way I see it, it's broadly about the power of learning by doing. And so I'm wondering, when you think about what do people often do in professional practice, well, the routines of work organize professional practice often. And so so I guess the question I'd like to ask is, in the world of professional evaluation, how might the routines of work carry part of the load to have the practitioner engage in the kind of professional habits of mind that you argue for? So how can the doing of evaluation and the routines around which we specify it get professional practitioners to think in the ways that you just argued for are thinking?
I think that's a great question, and I think that phrase, that the routines of work, meaning how work is done, how it's executed, how it's performed, right? I think probably holds the key to what I'm talking about empirically. I'll give you an example. I've been on the road a lot, and last week I'm on the external advisory panel for the Independent Evaluation Office of the United Nations Development Program. I should use all the acronyms. When you work for the UN, that's all you do. You just talk acronyms. You don't actually use any words, right? But one of the big issues there is the practice of what they call decentralized evaluations. So like, let's say Tina is the UN country officer in Morocco, right? So all the programs that UNDP funds in Morocco, she commissions evaluations of those in-country programs, primarily using consultants, right? 99% of whom have no idea what evaluation is, and when they do, they're just doing monitoring. They're just collecting output data. So one of the things that when we talked about how we would help Independent Evaluation Office improve the quality of those evaluations is precisely this, though I never thought of that phrase, but that's very good, is that to try to change the routines of their practice so that they begin to see that part of what you're doing here is contributing to a broad country-level assessment of the value of these kind of interventions for the people in this country, rather than, we had 27 mosquito nets distributed every week, or, 8 women came to the clinic. That's a very good way of saying it. I think that holds the key to analyzing the practice to build these kinds of things into the routines. That's an excellent point. I bet Marv has a question.
Tom, I want to add a question to the listing that you gave of issues to be resolved. How do I, as an evaluator, know that my personal values or my interpretation of public values are in fact able to serve the best interests of the program in which that I have a responsibility for assisting in their development?
Good question. Send me that one.
What'd you say?
Send me that question, right?
Send it to you, meaning you're going to respond at a later time?
Yeah.
I'll get back to you.
One of the things that I think we don't spend enough time on in evaluation is the kind of investigation that would help answer that question, right? What we do is we say, and I know all of you aren't evaluators, so I may have to provide a little background. We have something called the Joint Committee Standards on Program Evaluation, right? Which are these lists of standards like, the evaluator ought to pay attention to stakeholders, the evaluator ought to use reliable methods, this kind of things, right? Good, they're very nice, right? But they're absent a kind of ethical, moral focus. In other words, what is it that we're trying to do here in serving the public good? All right. Now, the American Evaluation Association also has a set of ethical guidelines. They're called guiding principles for evaluators. And they're like most sets, like everybody ought to be competent. Good idea. Everybody ought to do systematic inquiry. Good idea. Everybody ought to respect the rights of the clients and stakeholders. Good idea. And then there's one that's called a promotion of the public good. We don't want to talk about that, right? Because that involves hard-nosed, complicated discussions of values. And we don't want to go there, which is really ironic for a profession that claims it's about valuing, right? But if you also look at the failure to have those conversations is what led, in some ways, in the eyes of some, to the erosion of the idea of professionalism in accounting, and led to the Anderson collapse. It's certainly what's demoralizing a lot of doctors that work in HMOs. If you go just talk to your own one in an HMO, ask him how you think about what he thinks or she thinks it means to be a doctor these days. It's to be providing services from a list that is managed by a manager, not by a doctor, by the HMO manager. Right? So it's the failure to find a way to have those kind of conversations that lead to answering those kind of questions that is, in my judgment, the problem. And that, of course, the reason I'm talking about this kind of notion of technical professionalism, because that's what's happening. Yeah.
Meaning I'll get back to you on 5 or 6 years.
Exactly.
Maybe.
I noticed you had talked about university level education being really important. And as I'm out there hiring people to come into the evaluation work, many of them are coming in with masters. And I'm noticing you only have so much time in a master's program, and that either they're only doing social issues or they're only doing technical issues, but there's this difficulty in doing both in 1 to 2 years.
Sure.
And I even noticed within my own, being here a product of the Department of Ed, first I got the social justice through the TEP program, and that really came through. And then I got the technical, there's social justice as well, but more of that how to create proper measures, et cetera, as I went through my doctorate program in the psychological studies of education. And so I worry that even at the university level, we're still dealing with this issue of combining both the social issue and the technical.
Sure. No, I agree. It's a perennial problem. But my point, I think, is that at the graduate training level, at the PhD level or EDD, doctoral level, this is our only hope. If we can't find a way to wed these ideas of these two sort of things you're saying into the preparation of these people, all right? Now, it doesn't just to be evaluators, it could be academic researchers too. I'd see the same loss. I was head of my department for quite some time, and with cognitive psychologists, developmental psychologists, I see the same loss of the ideal of professionalism there in some ways.
I was thinking about the professional society, so I noticed that the Canadian Evaluation Society, they're doing a certification for their evaluators. I know the European Evaluation Society is working on similar thoughts. How does that play in with these? Is there any promise for developing a life of the mind in that, or what, how?
I don't think so. In my book, I talk about this, but I think that the mentality, these are people I know, so I'm not trying to criticize them personally, but the mentality of saying, here's a list of the 27 competencies that you're supposed to have to be an evaluator, is not getting at anything about the nature of professionalism. I have I have a son-in-law who is a plumber, and he has lists of competencies too, right? And make him a good plumber, right? So much I could have said in this talk. I could have limited it to 5 minutes, and you would have said thank you. That would have been good. But I could have focused strictly on that issue of that. The meaning of professionalism is not its technical prowess, but its ethical relation to the purpose of it. All right, and we just don't talk about that very often. Right? except in now, and I had long discussion, and you know him, some of you won't know who I'm talking about. His name is Bob Picciotto. He was the former director of evaluation at the World Bank. He's famous in the international evaluation community. And he and I were talking about this, and he said, don't you agree? I said, don't you agree that what you see is that evaluation is not a public good anymore, or very little a public good, it's a market good. And he said, yeah, absolutely. That's certainly what's happening in the international development community, right? And I worry about it at the federal level too, here in the US. I mean, what is it, Eleanor Chilemsky, the former director of the, well, at that time was called the General Government Accounting Office, now the Government Accountability Office, has written a paper about what she calls the single narrative, right, in federal policy making, which is, the line is, the only way that we will move forward is evidence-based policy, right? The single narrative, nothing else fits. Supported by John Barron and the Coalition for Evidence-Based Policy, and the recent, you guys got to read the IES thing that came out yesterday on the blog. They asked, what are the yet remaining unsolved issues in P-12 education, as opposed to all the other ones we've solved, right? And, because we're going to take the bits of money, IES says, we're going to take the bits of money that are attached as evaluations, right, to these little bits of money, and put them all in a big pool and go after these big problems. This is the new idea. Yes. Oh, yeah.
Question about values and how we reconcile values in such a politicized climate. And in a climate where everybody thinks they're evaluators, and if you look, you mentioned like the Brookings Institution, and there are other institutions that have political leanings.
Sure.
Where if you have a value, you can have a technical set of skills to find the finding that you want to find. So how do you reconcile?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And when we were writing the National Research Council report, using science as evidence in public policy, we looked at this question, and we convened a hearing on the Hill with with some of the major players that involved in the writing up of the legislation. These aren't the senators or anything; these are the people who actually do it, right? These are the staffers, and we said to them, how do you think about evidence that comes, scientific evidence that comes from different sources? Because we're concerned about the advocacy science issue. And they said, it's not a problem for us. And I said, what do you mean it's not a problem for you? He said, well, we know if we get something from the Hudson Institute, it's going to have this line. We know if it comes from the Brookings Institute, it's going to have this line. We know if it comes from the Thomas Fordham Foundation, it's going to, all right, we know all those things, but we still want to hear it. Because that's one way in which we can take all these points of view into consideration. So then we said, but so do you think it's like cooking the evidence? She said, no, it's not cooking the evidence. It's just that they will marshal evidence in an advocacy way, all right? And some will not. But they said, this is important to us as a way we think about these. But now that's in a political policy-making environment where they're probably behaving very smartly about that, right? So I don't think you conduct the problem of advocacy science. If you really want to see that played out, I don't know, any of you are like environmental biologists, but you are? No. Oh, okay. Go to their main journal, and you will see this played out constantly, because here are people like they're working in the rainforest, right? Trying to figure out what's going on there. And the issue is, but should my science be also fixing things there, right? Or, am I supposed to stand in solidarity with the Yanomami against what's happening? And they constantly are arguing about advocacy science. And another good book to look at in that regard is a book by Roger Pielke, P-I-E-L-K-E. He's an environmental scientist. He wrote a book called The Honest Broker, all right? And he has a particular stance about what scientists ought to be, which he calls the honest broker. But he sketches the advocacy science, the broker position, and a couple others. Not, take the book with a grain of salt, but it's a very interesting discussion of that issue.
I was curious as to what you thought the role or burden of responsibility is on the shoulder of the evaluator, whose moral commitment to the professionalism of evaluation may be incongruent with the institution commissioning an evaluation.
Yeah. Yeah, what do I think about that?
Jen, would you repeat it again? Give him a few more minutes to think about
Sure. Yeah. No, I was,
Thanks, Mark.
aside from educating institutions about what evaluation is, oftentimes as evaluators, we find ourselves working with institutions that might not necessarily really be commissioning an evaluation for the sake of a moral purpose. As an evaluator, are we the ones responsible for turning that down and passing it on to the next evaluator who might pick it up for reasons because they need work, et cetera?
Yeah, maybe it may, if you taught as long as Marv and I have, you know how to turn questions around to what you want to really answer. And not
You're a good evaluator.
I don't actually think that, people what I'm saying is that, I'm not saying that people commission an evaluation with a moral purpose. What I'm saying is that evaluation needs to find its moral purpose in society, all right? Now, but I understand that there may be circumstances where an evaluator has to make clear, and this probably relates to Marv's point too, how they understand the moral purpose of the profession of social criticism, of appraisal, okay? So that it would be probably, in my judgment, a kind of a large ethical breach. If you were to go into a public school system, just pick one, which has the enormous achievement gap between African American Latinas and Latinos and whites, all right, and not address it, all right? In other words, it's part of the obligation for social criticism to say, this is a problem, all right? You can do that in more or less useful ways, all right? But to say that, no, I'm just there evaluating the effectiveness of this mathematics intervention without acknowledging this larger value question would be a mistake. And what I'm saying, to back it down, is that evaluators ought to be sitting around talking more about those kind of obligations. If you were all doctors in the room, all right, I don't care what your specialty was, all right, and I said, on a piece of paper, write down what the purpose of your practice is, I would bet there'd be 99% agreement within certain words about what you said. If I get a bunch of evaluators in the room, that won't happen, because they don't have the same shared sense of the purpose of their practice, particularly vis-a-vis society. Doctors would probably say something like, to heal the sick, all right? Or, though all the ones in the HMO would say, to get another job, and the reason this is so hard, and the reason why I think education in the university is so important, is it's the only place that I'm aware of where we have the resources to learn how to engage in discussion of moral commitments, as opposed to saying, you have your values, you have your values, you have your values, and that's it, all right? Debating moral commitments, moral directions, that's what we have to do, all right? It's either that, or then we either take up who's got the bigger gun, all right? Or we're all relativists, so we have three choices, right? I mean, either it's your values, and your values, or it's all power, or we find a way to hammer out these moral commitments with respect to the focus of evaluation when it comes to dealing with environmental issues, when it comes to dealing with educational issues, public health issues, right? And to be honest with you, those of you who are in the field, we got down on the wrong path many years ago when Michael Scriven said, as much as I like Michael, and we have lots of things we agree on, that evaluation is a logic and it can be applied anywhere. And I go, yeah, that's necessary, but not sufficient.
Can I follow up here? You know your example of the math program and your calling to evaluate the math program. Now, I think that's a perfect example of the point that, as you pointed out, a point that I had made, that this might be a personal value that is so apparently a public value that it's very easy to accept.
Yeah.
Okay? Okay. But the problem, the issue, and the problem is the extent to which the evaluator overreaches.
Yep. Yeah.
That is to say, it's a problem in this school, in this program, but it's not, since I have an obligation for helping to improve this program, I can't talk about all of society and extend my resources and energies beyond what is achievable for me in terms of my obligations as an evaluator.
Absolutely. Absolutely agree. I would just say, but I can think globally and act locally. In other words, I could argue that is a universal problem in public schooling in the United States. But my instantiation of the problem now is right here, right? Just after our CREA conference, that happened. Some math teacher from suburbs of Chicago came up to me and said, "We got this huge problem." And I said, "Well, gee, what public school doesn't?" And they were in a really rich area. And I thought, so I looked up. It was an enormous gap. It was huge. And she said, "What do we do?" All right. Okay, I didn't think you were.
I think this is a value-based question, but it seems to me as though we have an interesting divide today. It seems like many Republicans see education as a commodity. So you pay the money and you walk away with a product. Many Democrats see it as an investment. So you take public monies and there's a dividend at the end. My more than half century as a teacher, I always saw it as a process. How do we reconcile those kinds of differences, if we can?
That's a great question, and I don't know. I mean, when we evaluators face the same issue as scientists do in thinking about how to use scientific evidence in policymaking, right? How to use evaluative evidence in policymaking. And what we came down on was that you have to understand the nature of the decision making that goes on where you're talking about the use of it, all right? So it's just a simple fact that in policymaking, there are a host of considerations that go into making a policy argument, many of which have nothing to do with the evidence. Right? It's your point right here, that the policy argument will in part be an argument about political ideology. It will be an argument about what is the responsibility of a government to educate its citizens, or on the other side, that we should remove that responsibility and turn it over to the private sector. But my point is that the first step an evaluator and a social scientist needs to understand, and you'd be surprised how many have no idea about this, is the nature of the decision-making situation where they expect their stuff to be used, all right? And then we went through this long process, and I am actually working on a paper about this, is like where in a policy argument that may be highly ideologically motivated, where in that process of making that policy argument does it become effective to introduce different kinds of evidence? How do we prevent that evidence from being overrun, all right, and being taken into some kind of consideration so that we're at least talking about evidence-informed policy, maybe not evidence-based policy? How do we deal with the advocacy issue and when in the policy argument? And those of you who are in the field of evaluation, there's no work in this area at all, none. We got instrumental use and enlightenment use, and now what's Kirkhout, the consequences? Oh, yeah, consequences. It's not use, it's consequences. And yeah, but what you really need to know is if you're a teacher in the classroom and there's some kind of evidence about the effectiveness of various kinds of interventions, how do you get to recognize that as evidence in the first place? And then given the circumstances in which you work, how could you conceivably use it, all right? And we have to go through that kind of exercise in public health, in public education, in policy making, and so on and so forth. We have to do the anatomy or the ecology of decision making. And we're getting, Cass Sustein, and when he was in the office that writes the rules for Obama's administration, he's this big behavioral economics nudge guy, right? And he was thinking a little bit along those lines, but it's not sufficient, right? Somebody else, yeah.
With this whole idea of properly representing the values of the stakeholders and not just your own personal values and working on biases, I know that there's this strong message of being external evaluators versus internal evaluators, especially with this concern with managerial influences. But I also would argue that in the ideal situation, the internal evaluator often will best represent the values of those stakeholders.
Yeah, that's entirely possible. I think one of the things we have to be careful of, and this is another aspect of what I was talking about, practical judgment, discretionary judgment, would mean that one would think quite carefully about under what circumstances would an external expert judgment, all right, matter, and in what circumstances might change agency be more appropriate. I mean, so you can't answer that in the abstract, right? So it might be when I talk to the UNDP, I might say, when we're talking to your executive board, we're going to have to talk carefully about those circumstances when you care about an external expert judgment. At the same time, because it's a UN mandate, you're trying to build capacity in those countries. So now we got to talk about when do you want one and when do you want the other, under what set of circumstances, as opposed to it's either this or it's that, because we always want to do that. It's either internal or it's external, right? Or and I think we have to be schooled in thinking, in those ways, right?
If I've understood correctly, the big thing that you're talking about is there's kind of a gap maybe in the preparation or education of evaluators, this gap that you've called the life of the mind for practice, this way of thinking or this way of conceptualizing your profession. Is there, in the market, is there a demand for that?
That's a great question. I hear it all the time. And it's precisely the fact that it's become a market good that is the problem, right? That I'm trying to, push back at a little bit, all right? That I go to, Marv and Tina and some of you have gone to the American Evaluation Association meetings. I've been going for 30 years, all right? I started when I was 5, right? Marv was about 10, right? Increasingly, all right, here's how it used to be, all right? Now this isn't like, back in the old days when I was, I used to walk to school in those shoes. And all that. No, back in the old days, the way it used to be is that there would be a conversation about something one year that was continued the next year, okay? So some of you have had Gary Henry here, right? All right. Well, he and the crowd from Northwestern University, who do a lot of, at that time, back in the day, they were very famous for experimental approaches to evaluation, Tom Cook and Mark Lipsey and Mel Mark and so on. And we would have these really cool debates, all right? And we would get together one year, we'd put some kind of combination of people together and talk about it, and then we'd put some other combination next year. And we had a kind of continuity of thinking about things, building a way of thinking broadly about important issues in evaluation. All right. You go there now, all right? 50% of the people that come every year have never been there before, every year, all right? I could, for the last 20 years, have been giving exactly the same talk, and everybody would go, wow, is that cool? Wow, is that cool? Wow, is that cool? Wow, is that cool? There's no continuity of thought except under a small group. This is a sign that something's happening in the field, all right? Plus, if you look at the contracting kind of work that goes on and so on and so forth. My point is that if a profession doesn't have people that are thought leaders in this way, it then becomes not much different than plumbing. Great plumbers. I mean, my stepbrother or brother-in-law is a great plumber, right?
Further respond to that question, the issue is not whether there is a demand, but whether the evaluator is capable of creating a demand.
Yeah, that's true.
Through the way in which he or she deals with those who are in the program.
Yeah.
So that really, for me, that's really the issue.
Yeah, that's false. That's a better way of saying it.
It's sort of like, you're not there just to do this. You're there to try to create a demand for a better evaluation.
Yeah, I mean,
by the way, on your comment about the same speech, that's like the best job in the world as a comedian in an old age home.
Right, exactly. There's this famous joke that I have to tell you. That you like it. We're just gonna lighten up a little bit here, all right? See if I can get this right. Oh, so it's at it's the guys. These people go to this conference, right? This guy gets up and he's kind of looks, disorganized, and he goes, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm so sorry, but on the plane here, I left my notes for my talk. So please forgive me. It's going to be difficult. I'll do my best, right?" Some people in there. He gives a brilliant talk, right? People stand, just standing ovation. Same guy, a couple weeks later, goes to another conference, and here's this guy. "Ladies and gentlemen, please forgive me. I left my notes on the plane." It's not a great joke. It's just a
Do you have a response to David Coleman's and Will Gates and the Arnie Duncan's, people who've never taught a single day in their life but seem to know more about teaching than anyone else?
Yeah, well, it's scary. Gates is directing educational policy in the United States. And those guys circulating in and out of Gates and in and out of Arnie's shop. And of course, that's all going to change now, but I don't think it'll matter much because the Common Core and all that is a Gates-inspired effort, right? He got the school, state superintendent group together and got them around that, and I think that's not going to change it. And then, of course, you've got all this really weird reaction to it that is really hard to figure out. But my response is maybe we can get Gates to give us some money to criticize him. It's such a big outfit, he wouldn't even know, right? They got so much money, they don't know what to do with it. It's the corporatization of public education is a frightening thing, and probably you guys know more about that than me. I haven't done a lot of work on the ground in it. Well, we have a project now on teacher decision-making using data, or lack of teacher decision-making using data. But I haven't done a lot of stuff in the schools lately, except for this one.
I have a question. I'm not in your field, so probably this question is really out of...
It's great. I'm not in yours either. So.
I do study the practice of high-tech modern medicine. And there, what it means to be a doctor is completely different than the general practice. So the question is, when you pose these questions are completely new, what it means to be a person is not just what you do, but how you do it yourself in the practice. You're changing the questions to be asked, what impact so this have on the methods that you will have to use to do this?
Yeah, I remember I held an appointment in Norway for a while when they went to a lot of telemedicine because most of the population of Norway is spread all along the coast. Like 3 people here, 3 here, 26 here, 20. And there's no way they can all get to a centralized facility, so they were doing a lot of telemedicine. And I think that's a great question that goes with a companion one to this one in some ways, is that to what extent are the routines of the practice and its tools also a function, and as an anthropologist, I can see you shake your head, that would define the nature of what we're up to. Yeah, I think that's right. I had to write that one down. I got to write both of these down. Right? My next book I'll take.
So let's thank Tom again for a great talk.
Thanks.